Welcome back for those who managed to stay until the very end. We have the last session today is a panel discussion, and the main aim of this session will be to discuss with the four speakers you have already met. Except, I mean, you will hear the talk of tomorrow from Professor Greenberger and Olival Freire, and it's also my pleasure to introduce Tanja Traxler, who has a background in physics. So she's still doing her interdisciplinary PhD, right, in physics, philosophy, and history. And she's a scientific journalist. She writes the Forschung Spezial page of Der Standard, the national Austrian journal newspaper. So the aim of this panel discussion is to discuss a bit the role of okay, sit here, the role of history within physics. So how history of physics can actually act somehow on the physics, on the working physicists. So how the working physicists can benefit from this, and what can be the form of interaction that we can come up with. Is there a need for this? So we prepared with Bernadetta a few questions to break the ice. So maybe the panelists then they can comment, and then we will keep it fluid, the discussion. People can raise their hands, and we can try to structure this bit. So maybe one first thing is it comes more from your point of view. So from the communities you're coming from, I mean, you both are kind of at the edge, but let's say you play the role, you're wearing the hat of the historians here and the physicists, and also in between. So the first question is, what is the physicist's view on the history of physics? So trying to see whether you had the same experience yourself or with your colleagues as what Bernadette was mentioning in the morning in her introductory remarks, that this is just a curiosity for a retired professor or something for physicists who are not good enough to produce real physics, so some side dish that is no more than a curiosity. And this second part of the question is addressing the historians. How do you feel treated if you participate in a physics conference, or do you ever have the chance to participate in a physics conference in your role of historian? So start with the physicist, as you wish. So somebody must start.
I'll just tell a quick anecdote to corroborate Bernadette. Is that right? What Bernadette said. Some years ago, 20 maybe, I was reading some papers by Schwaber. Is it Sam Schwaber, Sylvan Schwaber? Okay. Okay. And I was getting a lot out of them, and for whatever reason, I mentioned some of the papers to my PhD advisor, Carlton Caves. And he flippantly made a remark that, or he, what is the word? He repeated what Murray Gell-Mann had said. That Gell-Mann had made a proclamation about Schwaber that, well, when you can't do physics anymore, then you write histories. And it angered me when I heard this, because it was in direct contradiction to what I had wanted to tell my former PhD advisor, was that I thought that there was some insight in some of the historical papers that we might use in our program. So I think at least much of my life I've found that I learn more about some subjects by reading histories than by studying whatever the current state of affairs are. And I've seen this attitude at work. But Murray Gell-Mann had lots of attitude about lots of things, so that maybe doesn't prove much.
Well, I can just tell you my own history in that sense. When I was a student, there was very little available on the history of science, and very little on the philosophy of science. And so I used to avidly look up, as an undergraduate, books like by Margenau, I guess, and Reichenbach, and all these people sort of on the history of science. And as an undergraduate, I was lucky enough to do my undergraduate thesis under Laszlo Tisza at MIT, and he was known in the field for a co-discoverer of in helium-3 and helium-4, the two-phase solution, and I know he was hated by Landau because he got credit for the work that Landau also did, and thought that he should get credit rather than anybody else. But what happened was we used to take long walks along the Charles River in the evening, and he would tell me about his ideas on quantum mechanics, and I got the impression that, gee, that's what physicists do, you know. and after I got my degree, it was a long time before I met anybody else with that inclination to give long talks on history to their students. And so I've occasionally done that with my students. And then about 20 years later, I had the opportunity to take a sabbatical at MIT. And Tisza was still there. And so we resumed taking these long walks along the Charles River. And in those days, he had his own view on quantum mechanics, and especially on symmetries in quantum mechanics. And so at this time, I could contribute some, but I always felt I was talking to the master, so I better not too much interject my own opinions. And it's wonderful to have a man like that to instill in students the kind of sort of reverence and awe for seeing the field that they're in as a long history of great men. And that's only one use for history. And but he had all these anecdotes about famous, and when I mean famous people, I mean Maxwell and Faraday and so on, but also current people. And so I did get a misimpression of the field of physics, but it was a wonderful one, and it's lived with me all my career, and I wish there were a lot more physicists who felt that way and had this deep reverence for the history of the subject. A lot of textbooks, really, a lot of them just don't cover any history. They just tell you what's on. Of course, the worst ones are the math books, who, if you start off, you say, gee, what's topology about? And the first word in the textbook will be let. Let some symbol that you've never seen before represent some concept that you've never heard of before. And they're off proving, lemma 1, lemma 2, theorem 2. And when they come to a great theorem, the only way you know that this must be significant is to have somebody's name on it. but you have no idea what the history of the theorem was or where it came from. And that's why I'm very strongly down on mathematical writers because of that. Yeah.
Thank you. So I remember when I joined the faculty at MIT 20 years ago, I was coming in as an historian of science and had a kind of adjunct position in physics. So I was meeting with the head of the undergraduate curriculum for the physics department, a very large major, many students. And he asked, what courses might we cross-list between sort of history science and within the physics department? And I thought I knew my customer here. So I said, I'll teach a really technical course on origins of quantum mechanics, and we'll read Heisenberg's and Schrodinger's papers together in English translation. And he said, okay, well, that's interesting. Sort of, if you want to, that's fine. And he floored me. He said, I want them talking about the history of science in the sense of scientists' social responsibility. He said, I want them talking about the Manhattan Project. I want them talking about life under McCarthyism. I said, oh. And I actually said I was going to teach those courses and hope you didn't find out. I was going to teach them only on the history side. And so from literally day one, a course that I teach now has become a requirement for all physics or actually one of a small number of courses that fulfill a requirement for all the physics undergraduates, is on the history of science. And it's as much about kind of institutions, politics, social responsibility as it is indeed about some wonderful and fun examples from great work from the past. So I was expecting a reaction much more like what Bernadette had described and what we've heard about. And as a local fluctuation, at least, I had quite the opposite. From the start, I had colleagues in physics ask me to give a guest lecture if they were teaching an undergraduate course in relativity. I would give at least one class, not the whole thing, on some historical aspects of Einstein and so on, and it might have functioned as kind of entertainment, right, for the students, but at least it was had a spot in the syllabus, and so that was actually it was welcomed in a way that I didn't actually expect, and then later when I was able to get more firmly back into the physics department with research and so on. Then my colleagues knew even more so they would ask me to give more historical talks and so on. But I was actually surprised from the start they wanted a certain role for history science, and it was indeed for them speaking about kind of political situations and lessons from the past, not just how people have interpreted the uncertainty principle, and that actually impressed me. And I should also say, maybe this is set up for Olival, I have a feeling it might vary quite a bit by institutional context, by across countries, right? So in the United States, most historians of science, not all, but most, are employed in a kind of humanities or social science department, whether it's a department of history or of history science or science and technology society, something like that. And my understanding is that at least in many parts of the continent, not all, historians of physics are in physics departments, for example. So I imagine there'd be quite different relations that we might tease apart there as well. And maybe, Olival, you can describe some of that in the Brazilian context.
From my limited experience, so I teach in a physics institute in Brazil. I have teaching for many years, so it's a limited experience. What I can say about the first question. The first question I can say is that I didn't find any important obstacle to my research activity. I think that the physicists, at least the physics community in Brazil, they are able to identify, to acknowledge the work in history of physics if this work has good quality, or at least if this work is published in international journals, etc. This on one hand. On the other, it's also my experience that physicists in general, they are willing to accept anything which puts their discipline into the cultural history in general. And many times this means some nationalistic expectations. Then if I go to work with one of my students about history of physics in Brazil, I'm for sure that if this work has a minimum of quality, it will be well received among physicists. Now, this is different of the question, which is the motivation for this conference. history for physics. In this sense, I totally agree with Bernadette in that sense that this event is more unique than we can imagine. Indeed, I would say that in general, from my experience, physicists in general, they are not interested, they do not use history of physics and worst philosophy of physics to as a source of inspiration. So my own feeling is that we are in face of a few very important exceptions here, not the general situation. Here in Vienna, I think that we have also a situation which is a little bit exceptional in the sense that interactions between the group, the team led by Anton Zeilinger and the philosophers of science. This is one thing that is traditional here. I came here in 2015 to make an interview, to interview Zeilinger, and one of the questions I asked, it was exactly this: what's possible that you are so interested in having philosophers of physics interacting with you? So he gave me the standard answer every Austrian would say. So it's Vienna, it's the tradition which comes from the 19th century. So it's more a singularity than the general rule. It's my impression. If I may add a comment, I would say that this experience, the European Physical Journal H, which goes in the same direction of this workshop, because it's a history of physics, for the development of physics, I think that it's also a very innovative experience. And my hopes is that the physics community in general may change in the direction to be more open to these interactions with historians of physics and philosophers of physics. But this does not seem to me be the rule so far. And it's my impression that Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in a certain sense, he reflected this view among physicists that the history may be harmful to the training of a scientist. And on the opposite side, this idea was reinforced by Thomas Kuhn's book. So it's my impression that when I received this invitation by Bernadette and Flavio, I was very glad, because I think that this is not the norm. So it's a complex situation, what I want to say. Physicists in general, they are very open to listen or to interact with the historians of physics. The American Physics Society has a forum of history of physics, but this is different if you ask if history of physics is important, may be important for their activity. Now, the second question I want to comment. For a historian of physics, at least from my perspective, which is a perspective when we try to combine this kind of institutional and political and economic considerations with the science content, from this perspective, we as historians, we need to interact as historians with historians of science, with historians in general. In the end of the day, we are working on a historical discipline. We have seen David Kaiser claim that he was very careful to not incur in anachronism. But I would say that the second audience of my work, and I think that the second audience, but on the same foot, on the same level, the second audience is physicists and physics students. It's my impression and because you have an audience of people who are able to read and criticize in a very clever manner the things you are doing. And by contrast, only historians of physics and sometimes historians of mathematics are able to criticize in a very professional manner the works we are doing. If I send a paper for a historian of biology, historian of 19th century, these kind of people are not experts to. So I think that historians of physics, they are a little bit pressed. On one side, historians, on the other side, physicists. But this is the way we decided to live, because we like both, and then we should not blame our fate.
Yeah, in accordance with my co-speakers, I would very much agree that, it might be impossible to give a general characterization how physicists feel toward philosophy of science. There are physicists who feel quite, inspired by philosophical research, and others maybe not so much. There are places that have a stronger historical tradition, also within physical research, like also Vienna, but this also, of course, changes over times. If we go back in Vienna, like 50 years ago, there was not much going on here, and it's, thanks to some newer initiatives, like also this symposia, that more is going on in that respect. I would also claim that even physicists who might not have the feeling that philosophical research might be inspiration for the scientific endeavor, even for them, historical analysis might play an important role, maybe on indirect paths. Some of you have mentioned some examples where really historical research has fostered scientific and the scientific endeavor. Of course, there are also prominent examples from the past, like Einstein, who says that it's the problematic character of the concept that we have embedded with our mother's milk that may prevent us to have some fundamental breakthroughs. And also on a more, as a science writer, if I may, for a minute, take the position of the general observer, also for the more general audience. The historical research outlining the human side of the scientific endeavor might be an important entry into getting excited about scientific findings, etc.
If I can just follow up with an anecdote related to that, the part about getting excited. There's in the history of quantum information theory, there was a family, a Polish family, the Horodeckis. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly. A father and 3 sons who were proving some of the most amazing things about the concept of entanglement in the mid-90s, early 2000s. And you could count on some of the best papers in the field coming from the Horodeckis. One time I was with Charles Bennett, one of the founders, one of the inventors of quantum teleportation and the idea of reversible computation and so much in the field. Charles and I were talking to one of the Horodeckis, and Charles said to him, all 3, you and your 2 brothers are working, you're doing science. How did your father convince you to do science? None of my children, Charles said, none of my children turned into scientists. And the Horodecky boy, I really should say boy, he was maybe 17 at the time, said that when he and his brothers were very young, the father would give them books about the revolutions of quantum mechanics, revolution in relativity, and they were nursed on this idea that these were very exciting times and that it was a great adventure. And the father had done this intentionally with the hope of instilling the desire for a revolution in physics in his sons, and they followed through. So I think that is quite a role that history for physics can play.
Here's an opposite anecdote. I was asked some years ago to write an exam for the master's degree students, and who weren't going to go on to PhDs, and so I thought I would give them one easy question, which was a 20 points out of 100 on the exam, and so I listed 10 very famous experiments like the Michelson-Morley experiment, and Millikan oil drop experiment, and 10 experiments like that. And I asked them to write one sentence on each of these experiments, and the average student got about one right. And I was flabbergasted. I thought it was an easy question. And so that at least that's how at City College, that's how much history the students get.
I mean, the audience can ask to contribute questions or comment also on the same question that I posed to them. So we can also, on there. I have many in case you don't have, but.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful event and for all your contributions. I would just want to pick up this thread on history and also communication of sciences in general, because this is something very crucial. We all live in a society which is shaped so much by sciences, but I feel the understanding of sciences is lacking, or at least the inclusion of what scientific facts are telling us. So in that sense, I feel it's really very important, and thank you for raising awareness in this. Thank you.
Thanks. I just have a quick question to Olival Freire. You mentioned the Structures book by Kuhn, but I didn't understand what you said about that. So did you say that Kuhn in that book already commented on the role of the historian of science for the sciences themselves? Was it something along these lines? Could you maybe say again what exactly Kuhn said about that?
The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, many times it's a book that people read focusing on the revolution or scientific revolution, revolution in science, or incommensurability, which are the more problematic things in Thomas Kuhn's views. But Thomas Kuhn's views about normal science, from my point of view, was one of the newest things in this book, that most of the time, scientists, many physicists, they are just trying to solve puzzles, just to solve problems. And for this kind of so the training required for a success career in science is training very focused. And then for Kuhn, history of science is something that can divert science students from their training. There is another paper by Thomas Kuhn, which is the role of dogma in science, something like that, in which he was more explicit about the idea that a scientific training should be a dogmatic training. It's a huge debate if Thomas Kuhn was describing or if he was prescribing how to train. But anyway, my point of view is that Kuhn, who was trained as a physicist, a theoretical physicist, he knew from that context that you described how a good physicist, theoretical physicist, was trained in the United States. So from my point of view, the normal science, Kuhn's normal science, it's not only an idea that he took from the history of science, the history of the Ptolemy, astronomy, etc., but it was also something that he was inspired by what he saw as training physics. And on the opposite side, I think that this book reinforced this idea that among physicists that too much history, too much philosophy of science may divert somebody from scientific training. You see, it's a problem because in the end of the day, if during your training you should not let me be more explicit. When I knew Flavio in person, I was amazed that he is being trained in physics, and he is doing a very good history of physics. I knew already David Kaiser with this double insertion, but I would say that you are not the exemplars about how to train physics. So the pattern how to train a physics is focus on solving problems. So this is bad for so I don't want to say if it's bad as a citizen. I think it's bad because it's history, the discipline which can from which we can draw the context of our activity, which makes sense to our activity. But what I want to say is that the idea of training physicists without history or without philosophy of science is very rooted, is very grounded in the scientific community.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions concerning the relationship between historiography and natural sciences, in this case, history of physics. And so, what are actually your standings, not just in the physics community, but in the history community? So, what is the standing of history of physics, of history of science? I mean, I know a little bit, but nevertheless, in the community doing history. So, I often have the feelings that people who are, I know from history of mathematics, where I have had a couple of years been meeting people, and so you are neither there nor there, so somewhere in the middle. And of course, the question that arises is, which fits this, the title of the conference is History for Physics, because very often we have history of something, and the question is, who is this good for? Who is this helping for? Is this a contribution to history? Is it a contribution to physics? Is it a contribution to what? And so this is part of my first question. And my second question is also related to your last comment. So how are you personally probably dealing with the attitude of not just people in physics, but in natural sciences in general, where since the time of positivism, but not just since that time, okay, you have some kind of apodictic approach towards this this enterprise called science. Yeah? So we have it this way, and then something comes from history, which implies, of course, questions of putting it in context, in sociological context, and so on and so on. So questioning to some extent what these people are doing, not just showing how great they were, but also questioning what has happened. This is some kind of clash with reality in a certain way. How do you experience this? Is there? I mean, I already heard that openness is relatively rare, but somehow being confronted with a kind of criticism coming from a science which tries to put your enterprise called physics in a context and reflecting it with the general history, so the general context of history being it social and whatever, political. So what are your experiences with this? Thank you.
Okay, that was a complicated question, so let me try to give a... No, that's not a critique, it's just an observation. So one thing we can do is write articles in many different settings, right? And so in my own case, as was perhaps very clear from my own talk today, not all, but most of my historical work has been centered on aspects of developments within the United States. One thing that's really interesting to me is changes more broadly in the American university system or higher education during and after the Second World War. And now that's a topic in which many historians who specialize in many topics within at least the United States are curious about, are interested about. And so I have aimed on occasion to share some of those insights I've learned, certainly learning much from many of their writings. And here's where history of physics might be, one aspect of history of physics might be of interest for, let's say, a general US historian in this case, is that like those plots I was showing of the sort of enrollment curves and so on, this became a common trend across all of American higher education, every field of study, religious studies, chemistry, mathematics, literature, physics, both in the good times and in the bad times. The difference was physics departments were feeling these changes first and most extreme. I often liken it to a kind of fairground caricature. It was a general portrait, but the features were sort of exaggerated. So if we want to understand, as one example, changes in American higher education with all the social and cultural and political implications that might come with that, changing society and expectations and all that, then shouldn't we be looking at least some of the time at the stories from the history of physics? When we also consider, for all the reasons I was glossed over quickly, in the United States, more deans, more administrative leadership in American higher education came from physics than any other field by the late 1950s, not unrelated to a notion of scholarship in the service of national defense in very many directions that took. So there are ways to pitch aspects of the work, not all of it. They're still not going to care about Bell's theorem. That's okay, right? They don't have to. But there are aspects of that work from which I had learned a great deal from many scholars like that, or about McCarthyism and domestic anti-communism more broadly. So there's plenty of points of contact with other historians of other kinds of things in, let's say, in this case, a U.S. context. And that doesn't mean that they're going to read 400 pages on this stuff, and I might not read their 400 pages. But there's an article, there's a conference talk, there are opportunities to build some of these bridges. And I think that's true. I think that model generalizes, whether it's connections to certain fields within physics or more generally. So that's been a strategy, to be honest. Or with, say, art historians. I mentioned briefly my first book was on Feynman diagrams, which are a kind of pictorial representation. They were certainly read in interesting ways by many physicists at the time. So I was really trying to make sense of those using, to some degree, tools from art history. Why do certain artistic genres persist and come to seem natural or realistic, and others are seen as a fad? So I was reading a lot of, or at least some kind of art theoretic, art historical work. Not that they're going to come and listen to, a lecture on Bell's inequality or vice versa. But that was a moment where I was really, really learning a lot from what I found really exciting about certain trends to my limited view, the only extent I could dig in. But that was a basis for a kind of conversation, an article in a journal there, give a fun, conference talk there and learn more. And so that doesn't have to change, the entirety of my work, but there's a way for a genuine bridge where certainly I certainly benefited in my work from those exchanges, and I'd like to think there was a mutual interaction. So I think it's about choosing targets. I work with several students in doing PhDs in the history of physics who did not have a very strong physics background, and many of them have written marvelous theses about other aspects in the history of physics that are of interest, whether it's about institutional or political or popularization. What were their research questions? Did they need to do 5 more semesters of problem sets in quantum mechanics to answer those questions? Probably not. If they want to do a thesis on some other topics of the sort we heard today, then they'd really better make sure they're up, with the physics background. And so, there's a wide range of worthwhile questions. And then I think we can ask about what's the kind of preparation or audience or format in which the investigations might take.
So related to this question, I wanted to go a bit more in the direction of asking the causes of the present situation. So why historiography of physics is so dismissed or invisible, at least within the scientific community, which also boils down, in my opinion, to kind of wondering what is the role of historian and the role of historiography of science and of physics particularly. In the same way of when we are discussing why there is not enough basic science or why we have to hide behind the technologies, we might ask what is the aim of science itself. So what are we doing science for? Is this to produce, you can take some utilitarian viewpoint. And for the history of physics, you may perhaps ask the same, is history of physics something that should exist for the sake of keeping alive a certain tradition? Could this be viewed also in utilitarian sense as a history for physics? Should be part of the training also of the historians, the fact of having an interaction, an educational role for the practitioners in scientific disciplines. So, okay, so the question is why so, and is this does this come from a rethinking of the role of historiography of physics itself?
I don't want to dominate, but I'm a little curious about the assumption behind the question, because in my experience, which again might not be representative, but I see actually an awful lot of engagement and genuine curiosity and interest among many colleagues, at least in U.S. physics. Now, I'm not going to say they all are rushing to take lots of history of physics courses or read lots of long historical books, but I think it was, Olival said we have a actually very active forum for the history of physics within the American Physical Society. They always have sponsored multiple sessions at the regular physics meetings that are often very well attended. I mean, the March meetings did very well this year for those sessions. The editor of the journal Physics Today, which is included as part of your membership fees for the American Institute of Physics, 130,000 physicists in the United States. Virtually every month, or certainly multiple times a year, they'll have some historical piece in there or on the associated website. So that doesn't mean they're going to replace the History of Science Society. They ask different kinds of historical questions or are interested in different elements of a historical inquiry. But I don't think it's a kind of us versus them. I think it's an engagement of a fruitful engagement with certain kinds of questions. And I think there's actually, if anything, a growing interaction, albeit of in some directions. And as I was saying a moment ago, there are many kinds of questions we might ask with many kinds of audiences or curiosities in mind. And I don't think I don't think either side is monolithic, and I think there are growing numbers of bridges rather than shrinking. That's my sense.
Well, I understand that you question the assumption behind this, that so you're basically questioning that history of physics is dismissed by physicists, but I counter-question this, and I think that if anything, they are interested in a certain history of physics that is usually considered among professional historians bad historiography, a history made of a presentist history that is only used to justify a certain theological aim of science without any. So all the dead branch are cut away, and so it's just a posterior reconstruction of what were the heroes that led to where we are. Is creating a narrative for physicists. So I think that is very different. So that's why the role of historians, maybe they can bring some more insight. Also, the physicists who are engaged already in historic activities, they are usually having a completely different understanding or portraying of how history went. So in this sense, so maybe there is an interest, but maybe it's not comparable, the two, or it should be comparable is the question. Should it?
Why would we expect them to be the same? I think I would have started from that question. Why should they have the same interests that other scholars might?
It's just an additional comment. Again, I don't think that in general physicists support or admire a role of history of physics to train physics, to train physicists. I think that this is a kind of a core problem to be faced. But at the same time, along similar lines David just talked, I think that physicists in general, they are able to support history of physics and good history of physics because they think that physics is part of the culture, and they had a very good experience in the 20th century that to have a good image of science in society is necessary because in the end of the day, it's the society who funds science. The experience of this American accelerator, it's very clear. It was not an authoritarian government. It was not something like the Soviet part prohibiting genetics in the Soviet Union. It was the American Congress telling, no, we don't want this accelerator, with support of some important American physicists. Then I think that we have room, we have audience to good history of physics, and it's true that it depends on the audience. One thing is a paper for physics today, or another different thing is a paper for HSNS or studying the history and the philosophy of modern physics. So you have different vehicles, different kind of texts, but I do not share the idea that in general physicists like a kind of history which is more presentist in the sense that historians of science in general do not like. And on the opposite side, I would say that if your experience with American historians about the history of America, the United States in the 20th century is more inducive to the relation, to the role of physics in American history. But I would say that when you deal with historians in general, and again, from my experience, many times some of our best historians in Brazil, I have a kind of pacific coexistence with them because we are sometimes on the same board deciding the small funds to some of them say, okay, I respect your work, but I do not understand anything about what you are doing. I was telling this story. One of our best historian in Brazil, he works on the history of slavery in Brazil. He said to me this one, I support everything you apply at the CNPq, but I do not understand. So this, I prefer a physicist who criticizes my point of view than a historian who just say, if you take, for instance, history of Cold War, if you some of the general historians of Cold War, if you take Westad, it was J. Westad, it was the last. Maybe I am wrong about the name. He didn't say anything about science. So Cold War was something without science and technology. So I think we have problem with the historians in general, and I would say that at the limit, it's easier to dialogue with physicists than with historians. But by contrast, I think that the history of science is it's a historical discipline. Then we need historical approach. That's why we need to interact and to read things that historians are doing.
Now, I just want to say that you are assuming that physicists are reading historical papers in your way of reasoning, which I don't think is the case.
Maybe a clarification. I don't think that they in general are reading. But again, it's my limited experience. I have good readers of my papers in the Brazilian community of physicists. Just a few, but they are important to read for me.
Just a quick footnote to your comment before, to portray history within physics like a way of celebrating or highlighting the old heroes that have brought us all the way we are standing now. This might be one way to do history within physics, but I think it also opens historical analysis of physical research, also opens quite another way. And since we are here in the Lisa Meitner lecture, I would like to highlight the case of Lisa Meitner, where historical research opens really clearly the possibility to highlight also the exclusion mechanisms that are at work for underrepresented groups. For the case of Meitner, for example, in terms of gender but also nationality, of course, one cannot one-to-one bring these exclusion mechanisms to the present time, but still here the historical analysis allows for seeing more clearly and more precise what mechanisms might be at work. So yeah, history can be both celebrating the story of the heroes once again and again, or also shedding new light on those who haven't been seen as the heroes so far and for whatever reasons.
Yeah, when I teach, say, a modern physics course, I spend a lot of time on anecdotes and historical anecdotes, and some from my own private experiences. But for example, I always talk about Lisa Meitner when I talk about nuclear fission. And the class likes things like that. Or, for example, if I'm talking about X-rays, I'll talk about Roentgen and the fact that he had this Crookes tube in his lab, and because it was very hard to get high voltage up in those days, so he wouldn't turn it off at night. He would leave it and cover his instrument with a blanket. And he also happened to have, in one side of the room, he had this fluorescent screen, which people were using in those days. And he was about to leave the lab, and he turned off the light, and he noticed that the fluorescent screen was, because the high voltage was on, he noticed the fluorescent screen was shining, And of course, this really puzzled him, so he picked up a book, and he put it in front of the screen, and he could see the book. And then he put his hand in front of the screen, and he saw his bones. And so I tell him, look, this must be one of the most amazing moments in human history, that he saw his bones on the screen. I can't imagine anything more fantastic than that. And then the class, pretty soon the class ends, and I've only covered half the material. And then the next day the students come in, and they deliberately pepper me with questions because they'd rather, listen to anecdotes than to go ahead with the course. But I find it a fun way to teach. And I, not all the kids love it. Half the kids think it's fascinating. and the other half think I'm wasting all their time. And but you know, I'm not a great teacher in the sense that if you find this a waste of time, I can't help you. and you know, for the students who find it fascinating, I'll give them infinite amounts of time. But for there's some kids you can't turn on, whatever you do. Yeah, but you know, I find history, in a certain sense, it's a major part of both my teaching my undergraduate courses and teaching the graduate courses. There, you know, in a graduate quantum mechanics course, there are all kinds of wonderful anecdotes that you can tell. Mice is just one of them. And so I find, you know, it makes the course fun for me, and I hope it makes the course fun for the students. And I can't imagine teaching the course without this kind of thing. And it's pretty dull to just start. I told you that I hate the way mathematicians write their books. So I sort of go out of my way to say, you know, that's not the way I want to be. That's not the way I want to do it. And
yes. So thank you for touching on some of the possible uses of history for physicists or for physics, but I like very much the quotation that you have selected for this symposium, which is from Einstein. And what Einstein says is that historical and philosophical analysis give a scientist the independence from the prejudices of his generation, which is, and then the letter from which you quote continues. Einstein says that independence is the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or a specialist and a real seeker of the truth. So I would like you to see if you can comment on this, because this is a very anti-Kuhnian function of the possible use of history, teaching the history of physics to young physicists, that of giving them this kind of independence from the paradigms of the moment.
Because you're wearing lederhosen, I will obey everything you say. That's the only reason, Chris. It's a very interesting observation. I wonder, well, one of the ways I like to frame my own historical work, I tried to say briefly this morning, is about asking when did various questions come to seem salient? And to the extent that the questions that might exercise people today will not always map perfectly to the questions that exercised people before, then revisiting what had seemed like a very pressing question into earlier moments of earnest, engaged people can be a broadening or maybe a liberating moment without having to then sort of try to teach a lot of the accompanying, on what assumptions were they even starting from, right? So if it can be said, there's more than one way to even ask interesting questions about some topic that could indeed perhaps have at least a modest effect. I think of it more maybe along the lines, Tanja, you were saying, that one of the things that I like to do when I'm teaching a history of physics course to physics undergraduates within the physics major is actually not only to emphasize sort of the great and grand and wasn't it wonderful when a glorious person thought up a wonderful idea, but also look at how these really, really smart people were wrong more often than they were right. And that's not a critique, right? Everyone was wrong more often than they were right. And so if you're struggling, as I was struggling, with the problem sets, the fault probably isn't only yours, right? That is, everyone has struggled, or at least, nearly so. And if there's a way of normalizing this as hard stuff and really, really smart people whose names we venerate to this day were wrong a lot and reverse themselves like sine waves all the time. Einstein would claim there must be gravitational waves, there can't be gravitational waves, there must be, and we know that from really marvelous historical work like Dan Kennefic's great book. And if you can bring a little bit of saying, you don't have to get it right the first time, and Einstein didn't get it right. So that's a way of, that's its own kind of social mission. That's history for a purpose that's different from when I would speak with my other professional historian colleagues. But there's a role it can play that's not only celebrating, so to speak, the greats who get celebrated plenty, right?
Daniela, I like very much Einstein's quotation, but my problem with this quotation, this citation, is that I don't think we should take this as the way to an innovative work in science. Because if Einstein said this, but we may find a number of different cases where people were very innovative without drawing from history or philosophy of science. Now, I liked very much this statement because the idea of independence of mind is more than ever necessary in our current societies. It was important 20, 30 years ago to have the citizen understanding a little bit about science. And nowadays, I would say that it's more important when it is spread in the society a distrust of science. And a number of people who just do not accept the idea that the vaccines are important, to the number of people who does not believe in climate change and things. So I think that history and philosophy of science are very good resource to convey a more realistic picture of the scientific enterprise in our society. In this sense, I think that it's completely different to use history of science, anecdotes, etc., to when you are dealing with undergraduate students, than when you are dealing with graduate students who are preparing a PhD dissertation. At that moment, some of them, like Christoph, found useful to look at history and philosophy of science. But I don't think that we historians should generalize this rule, because this rule may be easily challenged by others saying, okay, this is working in one case, but it didn't work in a different number of cases. So my point of view is that history, philosophy, science studies has nowadays, by the same token, it's a field in crisis nowadays, because we needed to update our view of science. If you follow, for instance, what Bruno Latour is doing in the last, he is in crisis. He is well aware that many things that he emphasized, science is a social construction, etc., he understands that nowadays this is being used against science. So, but we cannot come back to the idea of a positivistic idea of science. We need, I would say, a more sophisticated view of science, and I have no doubt that history and philosophy and sociology of science are a very good resource to be used to build and to diffuse this more realistic view of the scientific practice.
Hi, thank you. Thinking about this independence of thought, I wonder, isn't it a natural thing and choice when someone wants to, for example, teach a particular topic? We teach Newton's, Maxwell, Schrödinger, and so many. Wouldn't it be a natural desire to go to the original source and say, well, I'm teaching something, how does that look at the original? I've been interacting with physicists for all, and usually they are interested, and it seems strange to me that our sources are mainly textbooks, and I know Kuhn has a lot to say about that. But at least, I mean, why do we need intermediate? Why can't we go to the original source and see what was the original thought there and learn from that? But then, of course, when you open the original source, it's fairly complicated, right? You open the first page, it's like, wow, it's overwhelming. The notation is different, it's everything. So I often see. I probably don't see myself a lot of a historian in terms of a member of a community, but I do think that historians can be these translators, this give these one-liners to physicists who generally want to know the original formulation of the things that they're teaching, but just cannot digest the whole, incomprehensible original. So how do you see this? Do you see, I mean, as historians, would you feel kind of offended by this kind of service, or would you see as an important service as well, in a way?
So I agree that it can be a kind of shock. Sometimes it'd be a useful shock to try to go back and read any of these sort of landmark papers, especially if they're really from longer ago than some short while. In fact, with this undergraduate class that I teach for the physics students, they're supposed to practice writing essays. They do their problem sets and all the other courses. In my class, they have to make sure they can use sentences, which is sometimes a shock for them. And so the first assignment is to read the opening several pages, again in translation, of the 1905 paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, Einstein's first paper, what comes to be known as special relativity. And the idea is they should write a referee report of that paper. So in the humanities, we would call that a close analysis of a primary source. We do that all the time. But here, as a gimmick, right, so that doesn't become a stumbling block, we say, well, write a referee report of this. Pretend you're an assistant to Max Planck at the Annalen de Physique in 1905. You get the submission. And the really smart students will know to reject the paper. It's a preposterously bad paper, or at least an unusual paper. It's not easy to follow, doesn't make the argument so clearly, doesn't follow conventions about citing your sources. And so there's a way of engaging with the text precisely because it looks so unusual, rather than saying, now I'll learn in full stop these great ideas straight from the master. And so I think that, again, can be useful to say things don't look the same. He was indeed embedded in a different set of concerns and conventions, and it was weird in his own day, and it looks weird to us today. I'm very slowly writing a physics textbook with a very dear colleague in early universal cosmology with Alan Guth, and Alan keeps putting more history in and I keep taking it out. I said, I love rereading the Newton correspondence with the theologian, which one was it? I can't remember which one. But we don't need to have 3 pages on that in chapter 2, right? Because that's not the most effective way to get students to learn what we want them to learn about an expanding homogeneous universe. So it depends on what our goal is. And I'm going to write plenty of things that I want physics students to read or historians to read or other people to read. But in an explicitly pedagogical setting, I'm not sure that a lot of the history science done in the way that historians might appreciate, so it's not just kind of cherry-picking glories, I'm not sure that's the most effective way to teach physics. It might be an effective way to teach other aspects about science or other questions. But in that very specific kind of instrumental mode, I'm kind of agnostic about it. And so there's a couple examples of I think it can be very tricky to respect the complexity of the original materials themselves in the way that it's so hard. We heard such wonderful examples of that even in the afternoon session today. That's a lot of work because it doesn't look like these very pristine, carefully synthesized textbooks later. So let's sit with that for its own sake. That's a certain kind of activity with its own motivations. And let's think carefully about what kinds of historical work we might want to do in other settings. And they don't all have to be the same. I guess that's what I meant, Flavio, to say. There's plenty of historical work in the physics meetings that I don't think would pass muster in the History Science Society, but it's not terrible work and it's fulfilling a different kind of role. It doesn't have to saturate all of what we might want to do as historians. That's, I guess, more what I meant before.
Yeah, I guess the follow-up on this would be, so let me start from the appreciation of Chris that he went back to. So in your talk, he went back to the origins. He took the papers of Bohr and he went through them thoroughly. And no, he said that. He said that in his talk. yeah. In notwithstanding Bohr, and of course, I mean, physicists can do that. is a matter of understanding whether there is any role for the historians to collaborate with the physicists, and they can actually add something to these. So one role is the one that was just proposed of translators. So it might be that the physicist doesn't have the expertise in the first place to even look where the useful sources are and to understand the notation, spend time understand the notation when they have, because they have had some dogmatic training on how let this symbol be, and they only recognize the symbol and they don't want to spend too much time in. So I guess that was hinted that one possible role of the historian for the, so I'm not speaking about the education of undergrad students here, I'm speaking of the possibility of history, and this is hinting at more what we had in mind also with this whole symposium, how the historian can be a figure that has some role in the research for working physicists. So besides what was just hinted of a translator or a simplifier of old notations and old concepts. So yeah, these are food for thoughts for further elaboration if you have something to say about this. So also for the physicists, would you think, or would you be happy of collaborating with a historian? Would you think would be useful to have an historian working in a physics department with which you interact? And would you think that this would give any contribution for working physicists?
Absolutely. No, but to elaborate, just for instance, when we were walking to lunch, I have just met Olival today, and learning a little bit about his interest, and the way John Wheeler, I knew that he had a paper on how John Wheeler tried to sway Niels Bohr into taking Hugh Everett's view of quantum theory seriously. A question in my mind is, did John Wheeler do the same thing with Niels Bohr when Richard Feynman had contributed a new way of thinking of quantum theory in his Sum Over Histories formulation? That is a kind of live question to me, because in the technical details of cubism that I didn't present today, Feynman's way of looking at things seems to be the more fundamental. And I would really love to know how Bohr reacted to that. What will I take away from that if I learn the answer? I'm not sure, but I'm convinced that I'll have some insight either in how to push my program further, or how to clarify my program, or how to present it better. And I know that I can't get hold of these kinds of materials, so I asked Olival this question, and I said I would really like someone to look into it. That's an interaction with a historian. The speaker who spoke on Eddington today, I went up to her. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. But she presented the confusion over whether Eddington was an idealist or whether Eddington was something else than an idealist. And I went to her and I said, I would really like to know the answer, because a number of people that I respect have told me that there's a similarity between Eddington and Cubism. Knowing the answer of Eddington's views or the historical progression of his views, and in fact, if he had more than one view, would be very helpful to me in formulating how I might move next with my program, or how I might present it more clearly, or whatever the third prong was that I used in the last example. So it's obvious. It's obvious that historians can be very useful to physicists. Whether physicists speaking about what their present day problems are will be of use to historians, that's not obvious to me. But it seems obvious to me that historians can be quite useful to the physicist for providing the sorts of things that will allow you to move forward in one way or other.
Well, there's one way in which there's a real mutual symbiosis, and that is we used to have, in my college, we used to have a program called the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, and it was team taught. And so I would be the physicist in there, and we had a couple of really first class teachers from the philosophy department. And I don't know if you've ever heard of any of them. One was Martin Tamney, who wrote a book on Newton, and one was K.D. Irani, who, and both of them were fantastic teachers and tremendous speakers. And I used to marvel at the way they would teach a class, because a physicist can't really teach a class that way, in that they would get the class totally involved in what was going on. And I remember saying to one of them that one day after class that he didn't take this as a compliment. I thought it was a great compliment. I said, I love the way you get the class to start making all kinds of suggestions and getting heavily involved, and you very, very subtly lead the discussion in such a way that it's sort of like corralling sheep, into an enclosure where you let them run around as freely as they want, but they all end up in the enclosure. And it's because of the tremendously sensitive and subtle way in which they could hear what the student says and then rephrase it and so on. And so they were wonderful teachers. And, a scientist never has any training in teaching. And he just picks it up over the years as he goes along. And in fact, that's a terrible thing in and of itself, that it's just assumed that anybody can teach. And where my wife was heavily involved in early childhood, and she's a superb teacher, and I always marvel, even when in watching her, even with little kids, that the things that a really good teacher can do, that when you're just a big bozo in the classroom trying to, because you've got certain amount of physics that you have to get at them during the course of 1 hour, and as a result, you do most of the talking or most of the, or even if they, you encourage questions, but in a sense, you're guiding them towards the right answer. And there's really very little original feedback from the students. There may be better ways of teaching physics, but it can't. And if you do, it's going to take a lot longer to get concepts taught and have a different motivation. And but at any rate, the idea of team-taught courses between a scientist and a philosopher or a historian of science is really a great thing. At least for me, it was a great thing. And I think for most of the students, it was a wonderful thing. And we don't do that anymore. All the good things nobody does anymore.
Let me make a comment. So about uses of history in physics teaching. So I'm not speaking about the use of history for working physicists. I had, in my experience, two different and opposite experiences about the role of history of physics in physics teaching. First, during a certain time, I was engaged in pedagogical research about the problem. Many people are interested in this problem. The problem is that how can you teach quantum physics for general physics courses? So it's not quantum physics for future physicists, but quantum physics for engineers, chemists, and so on. So this is a huge challenge if you understand that quantum physics is more and more part of the scientific culture. At the beginning, we were following the idea of presenting the historical path of quantum mechanics, from the old quantum mechanics to the new quantum mechanics, etc. And we had a good source, a good inspiration, which was this book by Tomonaga, which is historically based. But we did not have enough success about this. We discovered two important things. First, which was evident just because we were stupid at the beginning, that some of the early steps in quantum physics, for instance, black body radiation, it's almost impossible for a sophomore physics engineer students follow this calculation. So the historical paths may have some obstacle which are not easy to overcome. And second, the historical parts reinforce among the students the idea that quantum phenomena are wave phenomena. And then when you want to criticize this idea, you have a kind of a resistance among students. Then we just left this idea. We moved to a different idea. We have a paper, we wrote a paper with Ileana Greca, where we just criticized the idea of following the historical trajectory to teach quantum physics for general physics course. On the opposite direction, in the sense of the chronology, I had a very good experience introducing elements of history in other parts of the general physics course. For instance, the introduction of Newtonian gravitational force, we have used this thought experiment of the fall of the moon. And from my experience, this was a very successful experience. We wrote papers reporting the results. And I am telling this case because it was easier for us, so I'm not an expert in Newton's work, so it was easier for us, I and my doctoral students, to work on this because we just used the work which had been done by historians. I don't remember now the name, but I remember the press, Green Lion Press. They just took the Newton principles and they translated some of these problems in modern notations, some explanation that this was geometrical reasoning, etc. So I think that this is far from being something prejudicial. So you may use history in certain cases to teach physics. So it depends on the context, it depends on the goals you had with your courses and your classrooms.
Just a brief comment picking up your notion of historians as translators. I would also like to come back to your comment on education. I think the role of historical analysis of physics can hardly be overestimated, both for education and also for communication, not just within science, but also outside for a broader audience. And this is true also for a general audience, like general newspaper addresses, but also for the younger generation, like school kids, high school kids, etc. In German, we have this beautiful double meaning, also in other languages, for the word of Geschichte, history, which means both history but also story. And I think history is a beautiful way, an alternative path, not just mere simplification and popularization to make scientific findings and scientific ideas more digestive, also for a broad audience. You mentioned before Einstein's back and forth about gravitational waves to explain to a school kid or to the general audience or what LIGO exactly does with the interferometers, etc., is one thing. To tell the whole story, how Einstein changed his mind several times and the quite adventurous paths until the LIGO observatory is another. And of course you do not really teach physics that way, but in a very first place you can get people excited and have the door open to teach some more contents.
So I wanted to continue on the topic of history in physics teaching and specifically ask, do you see a role for history in physics textbooks? Because you said before that, to really go into depth, maybe pedagogically that may not be the best approach. And then alternatively, there could be a few sentences on history here and there. For example, there can be in the chapter on Hamiltonian mechanics, there can be a small picture of Hamilton and then 2 sentences about who he was. Like that's the type of history that you often find in physics textbooks. But then you can also wonder whether this is a good idea because it can create the image of history of physics as a series of important discoveries by very smart people.
So I mean, I agree with what Olival was saying just a few moments ago, that I think there can be many positive examples we can point to and many counterexamples to learn from, and I'm not sure there's a single formula. It also depends on the type of course, the type of student you're trying to reach. So I love teaching this course I keep mentioning because it's mostly physics majors who are often near the end of their undergraduate studies. They've taken many, many courses along the way. And this is the chance for them to again, engage in a different mode with material they've encountered already. Because oftentimes when they're racing through their problem sets in a course on relativity, they haven't paused to answer the kind of classic puzzles that I grew up loving and learned in some of these popular books. Will the rod fit when the barn doors close? I mean, all these wonderful ways to talk through as a kind of word problem, time dilation, length contraction, and so on. So we do some of that in this class because I don't also have the burden, as Daniel was saying, of having in my class making sure they can do 15 problem sets over the semester. So I have the luxury, so to speak, I have a different goal for that one course. So if it's one course among 20 offerings, then I think we can figure out a way to make that work. I'm not sure that we want to make that the model for every course. In fact, I'm sure we don't want to make that the model for every course, right, within the major. So again, it's a question of balance and what role should it play? Another role that I think of for the course is when I have young students coming in taking the class, it's a kind of preview of cool, fun things they'll encounter. They're not going to learn all the details now, but there's something really interesting going on with such and such notion, and they can go take more specialized courses in that. And for the students who are about to finish their undergraduate major, it can be more like this is how the disparate courses you've taken, one way they might fit together, as well as hopefully an appreciation for it wasn't so obvious, there were blind alleys, there were twists and turns, it was embedded in a society in pretty, sometimes rather complicated ways. So it can be a kind of roadmap that then they can zoom in on, either they prospectively or retrospectively, to see how other pieces might maybe fit together. But that's one course out of many the students would take, as opposed to making that sort of the way to teach each topic. Again, I think many of you will probably know and as Olival was saying, there have been great debates over much of the past near century of quantum mechanics about how best to teach quantum mechanics explicitly historical or indeed kind of axiomatic or in other ways. And I think what I gather from the lesson of that history is there's not a single answer. Right? There have been really compelling reasons why in that moment for that kind of student, this approach turned out to be really effective. But you'd have, it was a great shock when Landau and Lifshitz wrote their textbook explicitly disavowing an historical approach, because that had seemed like, we'll introduce students to black body radiation, we'll introduce students to photoelectric, we'll go all through the other way, and that's how we'll go build up. And Landau and Lifshitz said, now that we've been doing this for a couple of decades, why should we kind of keep repeating all those blind alleys or mistakes? Isn't there, in fact, a coherent structure emerging? At least so they would have argued. So that's why I don't think the historical approach is always, or the best way. It can be effective in certain ways, in concert with other approaches. Is my view.
Is there a question? Yeah. Okay.
So if I could go back to the question of the physicist's interest in history or lack of interest and dismissiveness, because okay, we were talking about maybe they care in some institutions more, or maybe they care about some kinds of history more. But do you think it's related to the fact that physics is doing pretty well in terms of the money slowly increasing and the students? And then we can afford to be quite insular, and maybe things are different when the situation is worse, kind of like how the interest in fundamental concept also goes. Has anyone noticed such a correlation, or do you think there could be some?
So to oversimplify, the argument I made in the hippies book, and it comes up in the newer project, is that there are moments when we step back and take a broader view, where at least in certain subfields of specialization, I think there is a correlation between kind of when the money is flowing without stop, that doesn't always encourage the kind of broader foundational thinking. I wouldn't therefore adopt a science policy saying let's cut off all funding for science because then we'll have great foundational work, right? So I'm not going to try to make that a policy. But I think there are moments in many different instances that I've looked at where there was a kind of interruption to what had seemed like a standard way to do things. Sometimes a very dramatic disruption. Funds disappear, projects are canceled, students leave or whatever. And what has often followed those historically in the instances I've looked at is a reorientation, a shift in the types of questions, a shift in the style of questions, or often I'd say a broadening. So it doesn't stop one mode, but it makes a little more room for contrasting approaches in a way that had seemed maybe crowded out by the kind of flood that had maybe reinforced sort of one dominant model. So again, and I think we can see that in examples of studies of gravitation, the emergence of a field like particle cosmology, which today is flourishing and doing so well by all these countables. I think it helps us make sense of the history of something like quantum foundations and eventually quantum information. So I think we can associate kind of pretty significant shifts in the way things had been set up to run, interruptions to that I think can have this kind of unanticipated broadening or redirection. But that doesn't mean I therefore say we'll get great physics if we kill all funding next year. That's not the lesson I'm trying to put forward.
Thank you. Since we all have obviously the interest in history of physics, philosophy of science, and this mixed field, we have all seen good and bad examples of lectures and talks on history and philosophy of science where people use slides and slides of citations and so on. What I would like to suggest, since our interest in history of philosophy, history of physics, or all these mixtures develops out of one specific branch or one of our specific fields, it would be interesting to see if there is a specific tool set for history of physics and how to get these tool set and how to set that up for PhD and postdocs to do a good way of philosophy of science and a good way of history of physics coming out of physics, for example.
I don't want to give a clear-cut answer, but I want to say that we are dealing with a subject because we moved from history for physics to history for physics teaching. It may be the same thing, but there are some difference. And if you take history for physics teaching, I want to say that there are some scholars, there are some important works that it's important to recover if you want to enter in this kind of experience. Two things I would like to call your attention. The first one, there is still a good journal entirely dedicated to contributions from history and philosophy and sociology of science to science teaching. It's the journal is Science and Education. This journal was organized initially by Michael Matthews, who also wrote a very nice book, Science Education, making a kind of a review of earlier attempts to use history for science teaching, and particularly for physics teaching. Not by chance, one of the examples, it's exactly Ernst Mach. And the second, it's a textbook that still today I use when I am dealing with students who are preparing to be physics teachers in high school. It's the book that the official name is History of Physics. Physics Project Course, but it's more known as the title of the Harvard Project. Harvard Physics course, which was intended for high school students, but in many countries, this manual still today it's used for physics to train physics teachers, and it's a good experience with some limitation. But I would say that if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, it's good to take this previous experience.
Yeah. Maybe in relation to the last question, I said that I have had a lot of contacts with people in history of mathematics, and in the last 30 years almost, there was a small movement starting exactly in this direction for making it a serious enterprise. and through my contacts, I learned to appreciate a lot that because many people had a background in mathematics and in history, and so this is quite a lot of learning, a lot of studying. So they had, many of them had at least 2 degrees or something like this. If minors or not, I don't know, but many of them are really firm in historiography and in mathematics, and the same, and that's why these people are not so many, and I think what do you think about this kind of difficulty of having in one person a kind of interdisciplinary approach, which can it be solved by having teams of 2 persons? Is it possible? Is it a loss of quality? Is it a gain of quality? Or does it depend? And doesn't it also, to some extent, reduce also audience? Because, of course, historians need to know about physics in order to be able to read this. Physicists have to have at least a feeling of what it means of studying sources and putting things in context and so on. So, I mean, there is, on my opinion, more of a diminishing of the level of tools of historians, so people coming from the humanities from people from the sciences, than the other way around. And when you have more contacts with people from the humanities or historians in special case, you learn that this is as difficult, as much having learned the tools and being virtuosity in using the tools as we have in our tools in physics or in mathematics. So what is your opinion about this this difficulty in combining the 2 approaches when somebody wants to do it in a serious way, which is possible, obviously. Yeah.
So Flavio handed me the microphone, and I think, and I'm going to, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. If the course is team taught, and by someone who really knows philosophy and someone who really knows physics, I think it gains an awful lot than from one person teaching it alone. A physicist can do a decent job in sort of presenting the history of the subject, but it's better to have the crosstalk between the two, and I think the students get a lot more out of that, and to have a lively discussion in a class between two interested professors, I think can't help but make the class more interesting. And so I think it's a very good way of teaching. My own experience, I had a lot of experience in that, and I always enjoyed it enormously. I'm assuming the students did. But the people I had it with were really magnificent teachers, as well as good researchers. But there are other kinds of courses too. We used to have what we called Capstone Courses, where they, like journalism's, before they had like things like SimCity, which you do online and make a game out of them. We used to in the classroom have it where you would essentially take a city and assign people roles. The editor, the mayor, and so on, and the police. And people would be assigned roles, and you would go through 1 week in the life of the city during the course of of an hour, and excuse me, and you would have a professor. There was a professor in there from the sciences. There was a professor from history. There was one from journalism, because they were mostly journalism students. And the students would on their own. They would make up all the kinds of things that you would do to help the city, and then it would go back to some source at one of the Midwest colleges that had it set up, and so if it turned out that there was too much crime or so, and the police decided to step down on the crime, then there would be a reaction to it. There would too many people arrested. There would be a riot. The beginning of the next class, you would find out that there was a riot in the prison, and so on. And so there was always feedback against whatever the class was doing, and that's, I wouldn't say it was realistic, but it was very, very interesting that way. And that was team teaching between a group of 3 or 4 professors. And it was a big class. It has to be a big class to make it work as a city. But as a semester, it worked very, very well. And for some reason, they've stopped doing all that. They did it it was for seniors in journalism primarily. And for some reason, the school has stopped that kind of cross-cultural teaching. But I always enjoyed cross-cultural teaching, and I always volunteered for it.
So I think also when it comes even to research, and not only in the classroom, I think there's a lot to be said for creative small groups. It requires a real commitment. I very much appreciate one of the things you had said about how there's a real technicality to becoming the kind of craft knowledge to be an historian. I think I agree. And so that doesn't mean, therefore, that every scientist who's interested in history for various reasons are therefore going to go do a PhD or even 3 semesters of hard graduate coursework, or vice versa. So I would love to see more kind of careful, small group projects that I think could begin to flourish. Just in the way that in the sciences, I often have worked with a very dear friend who's a neutrino experimentalist. I'm not, right? But I've learned a ton from these projects just within physics to be able to work with a specialist in some neighboring subfield. In history of science, I've had the great fortune, the great luck, and also the need to work with colleagues who are language or area specialists. In the next history of the universe, there's all that's left till our universe, expires. I will never learn Japanese or Russian language. I'm so bad at languages, for example. And I was really interested in historical developments in various times, and so I was able to work with very dear colleagues who were also historians, but we had a complementary skill set. And I think historians, although not Olival, but many historians tend to be still very shy about co-authoring or collaborative work. Not always at the Max Planck Institute. There's some great examples of small group work really being very successful there. But I think that's something that we humanists could do a better job at, frankly. Whether it's, again, a few steps away within some neighboring specialty within a humanistic discipline, or maybe even a collaboration this way. Because how else would we do it otherwise? How else would we get into these more juicy questions otherwise? So, yeah.
Is it on? Okay. No, I forgot my question. Oh no, sorry. It's back. So we've been talking all day about how the history of physics provides context for the physicist and gives the physicist a picture of in which tradition they stand. But for this conference, I've actually also become interested in which tradition actually the historian of physics stands. So I was wondering if you could maybe, or if you know a bit about how this academic tradition of history of physics developed, and maybe also how it is now, if this makes sense.
Could you try to be quick, because there is another. Okay, I won't stall. Okay, very good. So again, my understanding is very parochial. I know some of what happened within the United States, and I would imagine had played out very differently elsewhere. Within the United States, departments of the history of science began to be created with more regularity soon after the Second World War, for a lot of the reasons I think were being described earlier. This was seen, rightly or wrongly, as a kind of moment to translate in the nuclear age. Every student, every educated person, the argument was, would have to know something about the science and technology, and if they're not all going to become physics or chemistry majors, then through the kind of translating role of the humanist in this area, we'll have enlightened citizens for an age where we can no longer ignore science technology. I'm not endorsing that view, but that was indeed effective with deans, who need to be convinced of things. So you saw a couple departments of the history of science within the United States or North America more broadly prior to the Second World War, and a real uptick of institutional department making with this kind of citizen general education kind of goal. The idea was, of course, the researchers will do very esoteric things, and they might not be understandable to everyone else, but there's a pedagogical role for general students, right? And again, I imagine it played out with different motivations and different patterns elsewhere. So, and then who was staffing these departments? Often in those early years, they were indeed sort of physicists later in their career who had come to the history of science, not, I don't mean to say as amateurs, but it was a career shift for several of them. And I think of people like Gerald Holton, who did his PhD under Percy Bridgman. I showed Bridgman's picture earlier. So Holton did a PhD in experimental low-temperature physics, and then for various reasons got very interested in the history of science and sort of genuinely retrained in the history of science, and was very active in this sort of program building. Thomas Kuhn very much as well. Kuhn, as you may know, did his PhD also at Harvard in theoretical physics with John Van Vleck. Van Vleck wrote these letters of recommendation saying he's a very talented quantum physicist. If he wants to go into history of science, he'll be good at that too. But the letters, at least at the time, were very laudatory of a traditional physics career that Kuhn was choosing not to pursue, at least as these letters seem to indicate. But Kuhn, again, got this kind of history bug in the midst of his formal study, and he became very active in these kind of program building. So many of the first ones were historians of science, were overwhelmingly historians of physics, and among that set, they were often people who had a very explicit kind of formal physics training. A number of years ago, I did a quantitative analysis, lightly quantitative again, based on North American PhDs. The data sets were easier for me to access and reasonably coherent. And just looking at PhDs in the history of science, it used to be overwhelmingly history of physics dissertations per year. And now there are 10 kind of recognizable strands, and history of physics is 1/10. And there's a kind of, almost an equilibration, so to speak, across, it's like an equipetition theorem in the history of science. So that's probably actually a very healthy development for the field of the history of science, at least in North America. It used to be overwhelmingly history of physics, and now that is a recognizable branch alongside, many, many distinct kind of subspecialties. And again, as you likely know, more and more people going into the history of science did not do a PhD in a associated science, might have been an undergraduate major, might have been interested in comparative literary studies beforehand. I mean, so again, to my mind, that's great. I don't think that's a bad thing, because the field, I think, is now large enough to support many types of inquiries and many types of methods and questions that can be answered in different ways. So there was a kind of single model or a dominant model 50, 60 years ago, and now I think it is, to my mind, it's kind of in a healthy way expanded a bit from there. So.
Thanks. So since we have very little time, I would like to wrap up a bit what we got so far, what we agree upon, and perhaps hint at some concrete perspectives, because events like these of today, we are hoping that will open some concrete perspectives where we can try to work with. So something that perhaps we have reached today is, so despite the popular view that history of physics is mostly something for educational or outreach purpose, professional historians have told us that in their long experience, this is not necessarily the case, and the historical approach to education might not always be the best one. It depends from the context, and it depends from the degree of education. It depends from the actual field of study that these people are hinting at. On the other hand, we heard that the relationship between so the role that history might play into physics research is obvious to Chris Fuchs, for instance, and it seems that everybody agrees that this would make a great contribution, but nevertheless it's not happening. So this is not a reality. It's not. So what I would like to point out here is now, how do we proceed from here? Is there any structural problem into this? Is the academia that is preventing from the compartmentalization of academia that is presenting this? Is perhaps the should we maybe interest our students into maybe not using a historical approach, but at least teach them that history of physics is a thing, is something that exists, is something that is worth pursuing in their early career, maybe when they become actually a researcher, but instead of basically neglecting the existence of this stuff, or just making this completely transparent to their eyes, or even discourage them to go through it. So do you have any comments on how can we proceed? Because it seems that we all agree that this would make a great contribution to actual working physicists.
I'll wake up and say something. A little while ago when we were talking, and I had given the example of talking to Olival and asking a question, and I had given a question to Agni. And then I let the microphone go away. I found myself laughing at myself because I realized how abusive I am. That the way I see progress being made is not history for physics, but historians for physicists. So I think I laughed at myself and took myself down a notch. But I think there's some truth in that. What physicists generally don't realize is that there's a resource out there, and the resource is get in contact with a historian when you have a question that might help you in your research. And I suppose by hook or crook, just because I'm, what's the word, the mathematician who looks at his feet versus the mathematician who looks at the other. Since I'm an extrovert, yeah, I look at other people's feet. Since I'm a bit of an extrovert, whenever I have a question, I just try to go to the person who can answer it the quickest. And in some cases, it's a historian. So, I mean, if anything is to be done, I think it's maybe to educate physicists that there's no shame in asking historical questions. They can help you, and when you can't find the answer easily, just look on the internet, find someone's email address, and write a historian who might know the answer.
I mean, I agree with the thrust of your question, Flavia. See, we agree after all. But I think there is a great challenge, the kind of incentive structure for young tenure-track faculty, that the historians and historians of science need to get work done rapidly in sort of particular kinds of journals, at least again in the North American context, because there'll be a review coming and you have to make sure it's, and so there is a disincentive for this kind of collaborative work, which can require a kind of, moving outside of one's comfort zone and encountering new techniques and tools and ideas, and that can be thrilling, but also can take time when you have to get your regular stuff done, and likewise for a young tenure-track physicist. So I don't think we've set things up to encourage this all the time, especially among young kind of recent PhDs. It's not impossible, but I think we're not incentivizing that, and I don't see that, frankly, likely to change very soon, unfortunately, right? At least in this view that I have. Post-tenure, and then post-tenure, now you have more committee work. You know how this goes, right? So you have even other demands on your time. In that case, I'm just agreeing with the premise of your question, that it's not an obvious or automatic thing. And if there's a degree on the happier note, it's a degree of kind of consciousness raising. There's a thing out there called the history of physics. It actually has its own, kind of professional standards and techniques. It's not just Googling stuff to find out who said what when. Sometimes that, then maybe that's at least a reasonable start to hope for, right?
Just a few words. I think that when we're talking about younger physicists, and we are talking about the job market, so I think that this may be completely different from one country to another, from one region to another, from one institution to another. I don't think that we can have a general rule. So it may be the case, even in Europe, I know a few cases that physics departments may hire young historians of physics. I know that's just a few cases, but important number of PhD, postdoc students here in Europe, the same way as physicists. So you have a time as a postdoc when you can be trained. So I think that we do not have a general solution. In the case specifically, for instance, in Brazil, we are a younger community of historians of science from the 1980s, the late 80s on. And we strongly depend on two things very related to the things you... so the role of the deans, this is very important. So this depends on the institution, and the movement of expansion of economics or not, and the expansion or retraction of educational opportunities. In my own life, I had this kind of experience. I would say, for instance, in Brazil, in the last 15 years, almost all of my students who got a PhD in history of physics, they are now hired by Brazilian universities. But this was just a few years ago. Now it is changing. So my conclusion, there is no general rule. If there is one general rule, is that history of physics should be as professional as one thing that you look for higher standards as you look for physics standards. So don't anybody should try to enter in a field, either physics or history of physics, thinking that you can do a second-rate work. So this is the only general rule I can imagine.
So I guess it's time to thank our panelists. And yeah, thank you. So it has been a long day. Thanks for staying until the end. And as a reward outside, just downstairs, there will be a refreshment with wine and juices and some snacks. Tomorrow morning, we start 9:30, 9:15, and it's another long day. So be here if you liked it, and have a nice evening. Bye.